Hey guys, welcome to Unit 1. Just a couple things. First, I wanted to let you all know that I just had a baby last week, so I am home with her right now. You can always contact me by email. My phone number is available as well. We can set up a phone appointment. We can G-chat. We can Skype. So I am still always available for you for support in terms of course materials and in terms of assignment details. I will always be checking in on our student forum to look at the content questions as well as the assignment questions that you have. But I won't be in my office for at least a couple weeks, and I will definitely notify you when I will be on campus if you want to come by and have an in-person meeting. So that's just a little bit about what's happening in terms of my life right now and how it's going to affect our course. It won't affect our course other than the fact that our in-person meetings aren't going to be able to occur at least for a couple weeks as I'm healing and as I have a newborn. So these videos generally are going to help you with the content in the units. I will explain some of the more difficult concepts and I will definitely emphasize things for you all. So in this video, I'm going to emphasize 3 points for you. First, about self-representation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what self-representation is and what self-representation is not, and what this means specifically for our course. So a way to begin to think of it is to consider the ways in which you might understand self-representation within just everyday common language. So you might think a selfie is self-representation because it's an image of the self, but a selfie isn't a self-representation in and of itself that we would use in this course. It has to be in dialogue with some dominant coding or norms, gender norms, racialized norms, class norms, norms about what kinds of bodies are valuable, and has to purposely push back on those norms. So just taking a selfie of yourself doesn't necessarily mean you're engaging in the work of self-representation that we're concerned with in this class. It could be. There are Instagram accounts that are explicitly concerned with pushing back on gender norms or pushing back on racialized conceptions of Black peoples in anti-Black worlds. And those would be examples that we're going to cover in Unit 7. But just representing the self doesn't necessarily mean you're engaging in the kind of work of self-representation that we're going to be covering in this class. So another way to think of it is to consider also who's doing the representing. So if we think about like Hollywood films, or if we think about the kinds of medias that we consume regularly, like television programs that are scripted and unscripted, the persons who act in these films aren't necessarily engaging in self-representation. They're representing a character, or they're representing even an idea, an abstract idea, a notion, but they're not necessarily in control of that image. So another part of self-representation is having access to control over the representation, and having access to control over the representation in order to deconstruct, in order to push back, in order to create a context for meaningful dialogue about gender, or again, about race, about class, about disability, about what constitutes disability, about sexual orientation. So thinking about the ways in which the meaning that exists internal to the moment of self-representation that the person who is engaging in self-representation engages in is important here. So that intention and the meaning that exists internal to it. So this leads us to a consideration of what kinds of self-representations we're really going to be dealing with in this class. So we are interested again in those that push back on dominant and oppressive norms that function to constrain the selfhood of marginalized populations. So the course is entitled women's self-representation. So a group that we're absolutely going to be covering is women, but there are intersections of identity, and we'll cover intersectionality, the theory, next unit in more detail. But when we're thinking about the conception of womanhood, there's not just one conception, rather the intersections of our identity as women, as marginalized gendered peoples, function to create a context for a more complex analysis, or it requires a more complex analysis. So we're going to be talking about gender, but you can't talk about gender without talking about race, without talking about class, without talking about ability, disability, etc. So generally, we're going to think about the ways in which dominant representations function to control the way in which marginalized populations can self-represent. So how do marginalized groups internalize? Sorry, you can see me looking at my daughter Penelope every once in a while here as well. I'm checking on her. But so we're thinking about the ways in which dominant norms function to constrain the conception of self that exists for marginalized peoples. So how do the ideas about what it means to be a woman function to press upon my own conceptions of myself as a woman? If you happen to be someone who is Black, how do conceptions of Blackness within anti-Black worlds function to press upon the kinds of conceptions of self that you are free to have, or that you're free to perform within public spaces? So those are the kinds of self-representations and the meaning of self-representation that we're thinking about in this course. So the third sort of point with this first point is that our understandings of ourselves are oftentimes based in the way in which others understand us. And the way others understand us is oftentimes based in dominant scripts that exist on the level of culture. So it's not just the level of the personal. The personal is political. My conception of myself is very much tied to social meaning that is constructed within the world, with others. So this is important to consider as well. How do others impact the way that I see myself? How do dominant norms impact the way that I see myself? All right, so the second major point is going to be about your text interfaces and some of the general points that are made in the introduction to your interfaces text. I know there's a lot in that introduction. One of the main points that you should take away from this introduction is that meaning is constructed in a very complex way. So meanings interface, they bump up against one another and they inform one another. Meaning isn't straightforward. There's a hint of this when we think about the idea of like self-representation as being neither true nor false. It is simultaneously true and false at the same time. It doesn't mean that we're fake, or it doesn't mean that we're misrepresenting ourselves. But the way in which meaning is constructed, even in terms of access to self, the access to myself, is oftentimes mediated by complex systems that I might not be entirely cognizant of, or I might not understand. Even if I'm cognizant of the system, I might not know how the system affects me in a specific way, or in a specific or localized context. All right, so pay attention to the concept of interfacing. Interfacing is really just a fancy word for dialogue, the way in which texts are in dialogue with one another, the way in which texts are in dialogue with dominant norms. Means My Bed does a really great job of showing this, and the reactions, the critical reactions to Means My Bed does a really good job of showing this. There are gendered conceptions that are at work in the reading of her work. So what counts as art is oftentimes a gendered phenomenon. So especially historically, but also contemporarily, especially when we're thinking about the construction of new forms of art, what men do, what cisgender men do, tends to be seen as art. What women do, cisgender women, trans men, non-binary folk, etc., what gender minoritarian populations or gender marginalized populations do tends to be less likely to be seen as artistic, and rather is seen and reduced to merely the personal. I'm just giving biography. I'm not creating meaning when I self-represent. And that's a huge point of the introduction as well. So looking at those gendered norms, or those gendered expectations or those gendered lenses that inform how we read works of art or how we read performances of self is really important to begin to interrogate. And Amin's My Bed is interesting not just in terms of the conceptions of gendered constructions of self or gendered expectations of how gendered peoples should construct the self, because part of the idea here is that her room's really messy and we expect women to be clean. We expect women to be ordered. We expect women to be chaste. If we think about some of the artifacts in her room that indicate that she has sex. So how is her work of art a disruption to, or how does it function as a disruption of gendered norms and expectations that dominate within our contemporary and historical world? So pay attention to that. Also pay attention to the class indications or the class expectations. So because Amin does not belong to the ruling class or the wealthy class or the upper class within a capitalist society, her work is undervalued as well. So art is oftentimes seen as high art when it's performed by persons who have access to university education, who have access to training, who can travel, who can become enculturated within or through the history of art. So much more sort of populace-oriented or artifact-oriented forms of art are often overlooked as being art as a result of this history of construction of what counts as art. All right, and finally today, there are 2 points that I want to make about the Mulvey reading. This is perhaps your most complex in terms of theory or your most complex theoretical reading for the week, but it's really important. And some of the videos that show you examples of the male gaze within both the context of her essay, so she uses Hitchcock, so in the context of her essay, you'll see some of those examples in one of the YouTube videos. In the other YouTube video, you'll see some examples from films that you have probably seen. So our films today are full of the conception of the male gaze. It leads in these 3 focal ways. It leads in terms of the way in which the viewer, so when we sit in cinemas or when we sit on the couch and we watch a movie, we are invited to, as the audience, participate in the voyeurism of the male gaze. So that's the first form. The second form is through entering the perspectives of the characters in the film itself. So we are invited to take on the point of view of the masculine identified character. And this isn't always a cisgender man, but it's someone who fulfills that traditional role of masculinity. So it could be a woman, it could be a trans person, but the norms oftentimes expressed are those of masculinity. So even if we think about the new Star Wars movies, they're really great in terms of representation. Women can be strong, they don't have to center love in their life, etc. And that's really positive. That's good to have varied images of what femininity is. But what's valued within those films are still traditional constructions of masculinity. It just happens to be a woman or a feminine identified person who's performing that role. And again, on the one level, that's great, but that's not necessarily a valuing of femininity. It's a valuing of masculinity and constructing the male gaze still within that film, but it's just a woman who's serving as the vessel through which the male gaze can be performed and reified. So the third view that Mulvey covers is that of the camera itself. So when you see the camera like looking a woman up and down, beginning at her legs and like moving up her body, or centering in on her breasts, or sexualizing her. This is an example of the camera, this thing that is a form of an eye that is utilized by the human viewer. It's a function of the male gaze as well. So pay attention to that. And then finally, today I want you to think about the way in which language itself, both formalized languages like the ones that we speak and write, and symbolic representation are abstract. So when you're participating in the male gaze, when we are invited to participate in the male gaze, it's not necessarily always conscious, until we go through a process of like critical consciousness raising, we might not even realize a problem with the way in which women are sexualized in film, or the way this might have an effect on the way in which I see myself, and the way that I perform my subjectivity in a way that isn't fully free as a result of the images that I bump up against in the world. So language is complex, but also we're not always fully aware of the impact of the symbolic on our concrete actions. And so Mulvey's using psychoanalysis here. She's referencing Freud and Lacan, and Freud's conceptions of the development of self are very much based in anatomy, in the physical and psychological body. Lacan moves us to the level of language. And so she's much more emphasizing a Lacanian analysis, but you don't have to know all of this. You don't have to fully grasp Freud and Lacan. But the point that you do need to understand, and there is some materials in the actual PowerPoint slides, if you are interested in Freud and Lacan, then, definitely pay more attention to those slides as well. There are many avenues to sort of approach the study in this class, and you can set that up for yourself. But the general point of using Freud and Lacan is to show that conception of self is impossible outside of language. And so if conception of self is impossible outside of language, and the language that we have is coded within a patriarchal landscape, what does that mean for women? So how does a woman begin to conceive of herself freely within a patriarchal symbolic language? Is that possible? Do we need a new linguistic system? Again, language can mean what I'm speaking right now, like this system of communication, but language is deeper than that. It's also symbolic. So it's those images that we encounter, it's the meaning that is in dialogue with various texts, linguistic and image-based, that function to create a context for the complex world of the symbolic and the meaning that is generated through the symbolic and its effect on us in our concrete actions. So we're going to be thinking throughout this course, what would it be for, or how can oppressed groups develop conceptions of themselves that are free from the dominant languages or the dominant symbolic conceptions that function to constrain them. First, is that possible? That's a question we'll ask. And then second, what would it look like if we did engage in representation that was free from these kind of constructs and barriers that function to constrain us? So, all right, that's it for this video. You'll have these videos placed throughout the course. You'll probably have about 5 total. I record about 1 every couple weeks, and you'll sometimes see them in announcements if I want to make a general point to everyone, maybe about a discussion point. Then you'll see these videos pop up in announcements as well. So make sure you're using the PowerPoint slides. They break down the complex theoretical readings for you in great detail. It's not enough just to use these videos, although these videos can be very helpful as well. It's good to hear, to hear language, not just to read in online courses. But those notes in the PowerPoint absolutely are going to help you break down the meaning of each of the readings that you have each week. So download them and then view them in presentation mode, because there's sometimes extra notes in my notes. They're my notes for when I lecture on this material, and they can be helpful as well. They give a little bit of a deeper sense as well. Also, remember that lecture notes in these videos, they don't replace doing the readings. You do have to do the readings. It is really important. I know some of them are hard, but it is good for you, and you can always ask questions. That's why we have the discussion boards. It's also why we have the student forum. So ask questions if something seems confusing, and I will absolutely answer it for you. All right, so make sure that you complete quiz 1. and that you're working on discussion board number 1 as well for this unit. And I look forward to our engagement in this class. Have a great day, y'all.